What if I told you there was a film where a man was screaming for no reason and carrying a baseball bat in school? That movie is Lean on Me.
Lean on Me is a 1989 drama film starring Morgan Freeman. Despite receiving mixed reviews from critics upon release, it's become something of a cult classic among Gen X. And when you see the movie,
my motto is simple. If you do not succeed in life, I don't want you to blame your parents. I don't want you to blame the white man. I want you to blame yourselves. The responsibility is yours.
It's pretty obvious why. Lean on Me arrived at a very specific moment in American history. Violent crime was rising, the crack epidemic dominated headlines, and as public schools became increasingly chaotic and dangerous, young people were seen as spiraling out of control. Everywhere you looked, Americans were being told that the country was facing a crisis. And if there's one thing Americans love during a crisis, it's a guy with all the answers.
There's only one boss in this place, and that's me.
Lean on Me falls into the all too familiar category of movies about troubled inner city kids whose lives are changed by the sheer force of a single adult who cares enough to save them. Stand and Deliver, Coach Carter, Freedom Riders, Dangerous Minds, and my personal favorite, Sister Act 2. They all pretty much follow the same formula, but Lean on Me is unique in its focus on its central figure, Joe Clark, the megaphone-wielding, baseball bat-carrying disciplinarian, who is always yelling for some reason.
That means I can hardly read!
Over the course of the movie, we see Clark expel 300 students on his first day, chain the school doors shut, regularly humiliate teachers in front of their colleagues, and at one point, literally tell a student to jump off the roof.
Now go on and jump!
At a certain point, it becomes increasingly difficult to defend this guy. And yet, audiences loved him. But to understand why Lean on Me became such a cultural touchstone, we have to understand the political and cultural climate that produced it. We have to talk about Ronald Reagan, the war on drugs, America's obsession with tough love, and who we decide is worth saving. I don't like to use the term, "this didn't age well," because it ignores the fact that every piece of media is a product of its time. But Lean on Me isn't even really a good reflection of its own time period. Like, were people really just letting this fly in the 90s?
Now go on and jump!
Let's get into it. This is the crux of it all. Before we talk about Joe Clark, we need to talk about the world that created him. The 1980s were defined by a growing fear that America was losing control. Stories about gangs, drugs, crime, and failing schools dominated news headlines. To remedy this, the Reagan administration emphasized personal responsibility, discipline, and punishment. Cultural myths like the welfare queen,
Don't get your families off welfare!
Dare you talk to these people
Give
about
our children some pride!
helped shift the blame for poverty onto individuals and away from the government. During this time, Reagan also cut federal education funding, took steps to reverse mandatory integration in schools, and facilitated white flight from public schools by supporting privatization and magnet schools. As resources declined, schools found themselves facing enormous challenges with fewer tools to address them. This context is important, especially when looking at the very first scene of Lean on Me. The movie begins by showing East Side High transform from an idyllic academic environment filled with mostly white students into what is essentially a war zone filled with almost entirely black and brown children. In the span of a 3-minute montage, we see vandalism, assault, drugs, and chaos all set to welcome to the jungle. Enter Joe Clark. The state is threatening to take over the school unless 75% of students can pass a minimum basic skills test. So, on his first day, Clark expels 300 kids who he deems as troublemakers. Now, on the surface, this doesn't seem particularly unreasonable. After all, the movie goes out of its way to tell us exactly who these students are. Drug dealers, criminals, thugs. People who, according to the film, are dragging everyone else down with them. So, naturally, we, the audience, are encouraged to view Joe's decision as difficult but necessary. Now, out of the 300 kids Joe expelled, one kid comes back to beg him for a second chance. So, of course, Joe brings him to the roof and tells him that for as long as he's using drugs, he might as well just jump off the roof and get it over with.
Now go on and jump! Jump!
No, I don't want to kill myself, sir.
This feels extreme, right? This isn't the only time we hear this kind of thing in the movie.
I don't want you to blame the white man.
Over and over again, the film returns to the idea that success and failure are simply matters of personal responsibility. And while individual accountability is important, the movie refuses to engage with the larger forces shaping the lives of these students. Housing discrimination, over-policing, economic disinvestment, employment inequality, these are just some of the circumstances that cause the very problems that the movie depicts, and yet it treats them as secondary, if it addresses them at all. This is the same kind of rhetoric we hear whenever Black people are told to pull up their pants and stop using AAVE, as if those behaviors justify or even cause unfair treatment. The idea that the people, not the systems, are the problem. And once the people become the problem, it becomes much easier to justify giving up on them. This idea that tough love and a little personal responsibility is all kids need to solve their problems is not only disingenuous and untrue, but dangerous. Ignoring decades of institutional discrimination within Black communities in favor of blaming the individual addresses the symptoms while discarding the root cause. Clark may not have had the resources or the bandwidth to rehabilitate every single kid on that stage, but he shouldn't have had the authority to expel all of them either. Black and brown kids are already adultified and criminalized, and essentially telling them they are beyond saving at such an early age only continues this cycle.
We've got to be tough, and we have to take those young people who are in essence predators, even at a young age, and separate them from the rest of society.
Criminals, gangsters, thugs, predators, animals. This is exactly the kind of logic that the movie and real politicians use, especially when justifying the often inhumane treatment minorities often face for simply trying to survive within the system they've been born into. But we'll come back to that later. First, there's one major problem with Lean On Me's central premise. The movie wants us to believe that Joe Clark fixed East Side High by simply removing 300 bad students. But reality is a lot more complicated than that. Lean On Me is based on a true story. Joe Clark was a real principal at the real East Side High School in New Jersey. He really did carry around a baseball bat, he really did expel hundreds of students who he deemed as troublemakers, and he really did become a national celebrity. But that's mostly where the similarities end. The real Joe Clark was not universally beloved, and his results were far more mixed than the movie suggests, as seen in a Time magazine article from 1988. While math scores are up 6% during Clark's reign, reading scores have barely budged. They remain in the bottom third of the nation's high school seniors. While a few more students are going to college, 211 up from 182 in 1982, Clark has lost considerable ground in the battle against dropouts. When he arrived, Eastside's rate was 13%. Now it is 21%. Moreover, as his critics point out, any principal can raise test scores and cut disciplinary problems by tossing out the troublesome low achievers, but this hardly represents a solution to a community's problems. Rather, it just moves those problems from the classroom onto the street, where the dropouts drift into trouble or plain despair. So that's it, right? The idea that discipline and tough love can solve problems bigger than any one school or principal is a myth. No principal can solve poverty, unemployment, or decades of disinvestment in urban communities. But that doesn't make for a particularly inspiring movie, does it? Instead, Lean On Me gives us a much easier solution. Find the troublemakers and remove them. Problem solved. And that logic extended far beyond education. In the 80s and 90s, the Just Say No campaign combined with a zero-tolerance drug policy led to a boom in prison populations often filled with nonviolent offenders, and promoted the idea that deeply rooted social problems could somehow be fixed through personal responsibility and harsher consequences. The parallels are hard to ignore. Reagan himself praised Clark and reportedly offered him a position in his administration. And when you look at their worldviews, it's easy to understand why. The Time article is right. Anyone can improve test scores if you kick out struggling students, and anyone can lower crime by locking more people up. But if you do nothing to address the larger systems that cause these situations in the first place, there can be no lasting change. Nonetheless, throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, zero-tolerance policies and the increased presence of police in schools across the country led to students being suspended or expelled for things like piercings, hair colors, and even toenail clippers.
7-year-old Lamont Agnew was kicked out of the 2nd grade for 45 days for bringing toenail clippers to class.
Routine disciplinary problems that could be solved by visits to the principal's office or parent-teacher conferences now ended in arrests. The consequences fell disproportionately on Black and brown students, and what started as an attempt to create safer schools quickly became a pipeline sending vulnerable children into the criminal justice system. Ironically, Lean on Me seems to be acutely aware of this problem.
You treat them like animals, that's exactly how they'll behave.
There is scene after scene after scene in which characters object to Clark's methods, but we as the audience are still expected to root for him in the end because he's always proven right. Lean on Me is hailed as a classic because it's a fantasy, because we want to believe that all we need is one person with enough willpower to fix everything for us without doing any of the difficult work that making actual, lasting change requires. Tough love, zero tolerance, discipline. The unfortunate reality is that too often, these are just terms people use when they don't want to actually solve a problem. They just don't want to have to keep looking at it. This is the exact system that puts kids on a path from school to prison, that tells them that their circumstances are no one's fault but theirs, that puts 300 kids on a stage and tells them that they are expendable and beyond help.
My motto is simple. If you do not succeed in life, I don't want you to blame your parents. I don't want you to blame the white man. I want you to blame yourself. The responsibility is yours.
So, with everything we know about the school-to-prison pipeline and institutional injustice, what's the alternative? Because even though we all know the problem, it's a lot harder to talk about solutions. After all, the movie isn't completely wrong. Violence and addiction are still problems. Overwhelmed teachers and underfunded schools still exist, and some students really do seem impossible to reach. But there may be a healthier mentality that hasn't been explored yet.
Teachers at a school like Abbott, we have to be able to do it all. We are admin, we are social workers, we are therapists, we are second parents. Hell, sometimes we're even first.
Anyone who knows me knows that Abbott Elementary is one of my favorite shows because it deals with similar issues as Lean on Me, but with a more compassionate solution.
Now go on and jump.
One of the smart things Lean on Me does is give the audience a kid character for the audience to root for in Sam's, the young boy who comes back to beg for a second chance. We're supposed to sympathize with him, because out of all the kids who got expelled, he's the only one who wants to be helped. But what about the other 299 students? What about the ones who didn't come back because they were angry, or embarrassed, or convinced that no one cared about them anyway? Are they any less deserving of help? The movie's answer seems to be yes. But this all comes back to the issue that when your humanity is conditional, it is treated as expendable. A child shouldn't become worthy of help because they ask for it or seek redemption. They should be worthy of it already because they're children. Now, here is where it feels important to mention that Lean on Me was written and directed by white men attempting to tell a story about a predominantly Black and brown community. It doesn't mean that they were incapable of telling the stories, but it means that their perspective was inevitably shaped by the assumptions and narratives that dominated the era. Abbott Elementary comes from a very different place. The show's creator, Quinta Brunson, grew up in Philadelphia. She understands the communities she's depicting because she comes from them, and the difference is visible in the writing. The students in Abbott are not symbols or mouthpieces or cautionary tales. They are children first. Abbott understood from its very first episode that the problems facing their students are bigger than any one of them. And it takes time to remedy those problems on both an individual and institutional scale. But the job of an educator is not to be judge, jury, and executioner. It is to keep showing up, even when the challenges facing them seem insurmountable.
Barbara, I've never seen you fail a child. You always find a solution.
Oh, please, I do not always have the answer. In fact, there are some issues and problems that are just too difficult for anyone, even me, to solve in one school year. But if you come back here tomorrow, ready to do your job, having not given up on yourself or that student, well, that is not failure. Sometimes that's what success looks like.
The message of this video is not to stop liking Lean On Me. It's a very well-made and entertaining movie with strong performances and an inspiring, if naive, message. But as always, it is important that we remain critical of the media we consume so that it doesn't unknowingly impact our worldview. So that when we look at that stage, we know what we see.
I want all of you to take a good look at these people on the risers behind me. These people are drug dealers and drug users. They have taken up space. They have disrupted the school. They have harassed your teachers. And they have intimidated you.
Look at the kids on that stage. What do you see? Do you see what Joe Clark and the writers of this movie see? Criminals? Animals? Monsters? Or do you see them for what they are? Children. Like it or not, they are children. And they don't need to be arrested or expelled or jailed or abandoned. They don't need discipline or tough love, or not just that anyway. What they need is somebody to lean on.
Twice.